The tray in Elena's hands trembled as the ballroom doors opened, and 300 eyes turned toward the entrance, waiting for the bride to be announced, not knowing that the woman meant to disappear into the background tonight would soon become the only person anyone could talk about. Elena Marchetti had been given one instruction before the engagement dinner began: stay quiet, stay out of sight, serve the guests, refill the glasses, and never, under any circumstance, let anyone mistake her for a member of the family. Her stepmother, Margaret, had said the words so calmly, as if she were simply reminding Elena to wear comfortable shoes, not stripping her of any right to belong in the very house she had grown up in. Elena did not argue. She never did. Arguing had never worked before, and there was no reason to believe it would work now, so she pulled her dark hair into a tight knot, put on the plain black uniform that had been laid out for her, and walked into the kitchen an hour before the guests arrived, ready to spend the evening pouring wine for people who used to know her name. The Marchetti estate had once belonged to her father, Edward Marchetti, a quiet man who had built his fortune slowly and carefully, the way honest men often do. When he married Margaret after Elena's mother passed away, the household changed in ways too small to challenge and too large to ignore. Margaret brought her own daughter, Camille, into the home, and from that day forward, Camille was the daughter who mattered. Elena became something else, a helper, a shadow, a girl who lived in the same house but never quite belonged to it. When Edward died 3 years ago, Margaret wasted no time making the new arrangement permanent. Elena kept a small room on the upper floor, ate her meals separately, and worked without complaint, telling herself that surviving quietly was better than fighting a battle she could not win. Tonight, she reminded herself of that lesson one more time: survive, stay small, let the evening pass. The guest list for Camille's engagement dinner included nearly every important family in the region, but no name carried more weight than the one now walking through the front doors. Duke Alexander Whitmore was young, composed, and famously difficult to impress. His engagement to Camille had been arranged through months of careful conversation between Margaret and the Whitmore family, a union built more on ambition than affection, though no one in the room seemed bothered by that fact except, perhaps, the Duke himself. Elena had seen him only once before, from a distance, and had formed no real opinion of him. Tonight, she was too busy carrying trays of appetizers through the crowd to think about him at all. She moved carefully between groups of guests, offering drinks, clearing empty glasses, keeping her eyes low the way she had been trained to do. No one looked at her. That was the point. Servants were meant to be efficient and invisible, present only in the sense that the wine kept flowing and the plates stayed full. The dinner began with speeches. Margaret stood beside Camille, beaming with the kind of pride reserved for mothers who had finally secured everything they wanted. Camille wore a pale gold gown that caught the light every time she moved, and she smiled the practiced smile of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment for weeks. Alexander stood beside her, polite and composed, nodding at the right moments, offering the correct responses, giving no sign of what he actually felt. Elena continued working, pouring wine into crystal glasses along the long dining table, careful not to spill a single drop. She reached the head of the table just as Alexander turned to accept a fresh glass, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. It was nothing more than a glance. A servant refilling a glass. A guest accepting it. But something in the way Elena held herself, calm and composed, despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face, made Alexander pause. He had spent the entire evening surrounded by people eager to impress him, all performing versions of themselves they believed he wanted to see. This woman was doing the opposite. She was trying not to be seen at all, and somehow, that made him notice her more. He said thank you, quietly. The words meant only for her. Elena nodded once, out of habit rather than warmth, and moved on to the next guest without a second thought. She did not have the luxury of noticing kindness. Kindness from a guest meant nothing if it drew attention, and attention was the one thing she could not afford tonight. As the dinner continued, Elena found herself circling back toward that end of the table more often than necessary. She told herself it was simply the natural rhythm of service, that the guests near the Duke required more attention because they were the most important people in the room. But some small, honest part of her recognized that she was watching him too, curious about a man who seemed strangely out of place among people who worked so hard to please him. Alexander, for his part, could not stop tracking her movements across the room. He watched her navigate through clusters of guests with a kind of quiet grace, never once drawing attention to herself, never once complaining. Even when a guest carelessly bumped her arm and sent a small amount of wine spilling onto the floor, she simply knelt, wiped it clean, apologized to no one in particular, and continued her work as though nothing had happened. It was such a small moment, no one else even noticed it, but Alexander did, and it stayed with him far longer than any of the rehearsed conversations happening around the table. Halfway through the evening, Margaret rose to make another toast, this time praising the Whitmore family's generosity and the bright future awaiting her daughter. Camille reached for Alexander's hand, smiling for the guests, and he offered a practiced smile in return, the kind that revealed nothing of what he actually felt inside. His gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the woman standing near the kitchen doorway, waiting to bring out the next course. Elena felt his eyes on her before she even looked up. When she did, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. She looked away quickly, unsettled by the attention, and busied herself checking on the dessert trays, though there was nothing left to check. She told herself it meant nothing. Powerful men noticed servants all the time, usually without meaning to, and usually without any consequence attached to it. She had learned long ago not to read anything into moments like this. Attention from someone like the Duke could only bring trouble, and trouble was the last thing she needed, while trying to hold together the fragile, quiet life she had built for herself inside this house. But as the evening stretched on, Alexander's attention did not fade. If anything, it grew more obvious, though he tried carefully to hide it from the rest of the room. He asked a passing server, a young man named Peter, about the woman pouring wine at the far end of the table. Peter hesitated, unsure how much he was allowed to say, before explaining quietly that her name was Elena, and that she was actually part of the family, though she worked in the household now. Alexander absorbed this information without reacting outwardly, though something inside him shifted. Part of the family, working as a servant at her own sister's engagement dinner. There was a story buried beneath that simple explanation, and he found himself wanting to understand it. Dinner eventually gave way to dancing, and the guests moved toward the open floor where a small orchestra had begun playing. Camille pulled Alexander toward the center of the room, eager to share the first dance with him in front of everyone watching. He obliged, moving through the steps with practiced ease, though his attention kept drifting toward the edges of the room, where Elena continued clearing dishes and refilling drinks, moving quietly among the celebration she had no part in. At one point, while reaching for an empty tray near the edge of the dance floor, Elena felt someone brush past her, apologizing quickly before continuing on. She barely registered it until she noticed, moments later, a folded napkin left on the tray where nothing should have been. Curious despite herself, she unfolded it once she reached the quiet of the kitchen hallway. Inside, written in careful handwriting, were only a few words. "Thank you for tonight. You are the only honest person I have met in this house." Elena stared at the note for a long moment, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. She told herself it was nothing more than a polite gesture from a guest who felt sorry for her, the kind of empty kindness wealthy people sometimes offered to make themselves feel generous. But some quiet part of her, the part she rarely allowed herself to listen to, wondered if it meant something more. She folded the napkin carefully and tucked it into her pocket, then returned to the ballroom before anyone noticed her absence. The celebration continued around her, loud and bright, and completely indifferent to the small moment that had just changed everything, though she did not yet understand how much. Later that night, long after the guests had gone home and the house had fallen silent, Elena stood in her small room on the upper floor, holding the napkin under the dim light of a single lamp. She read the words again, slower this time, letting herself feel the weight of them. A man like Alexander Whitmore had no reason to notice a servant. He certainly had no reason to write her a private note during his own engagement dinner. And yet he had. Elena did not know what it meant, or if it meant anything at all, but she knew, with a certainty that unsettled her, that tonight had been different. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen more than a servant carrying a tray. Someone had seen her. She placed the napkin inside a small wooden box where she kept the few things that still felt like they belonged to her, closed the lid, and told herself firmly that this would be the end of it. Whatever strange spark had passed between them tonight would fade by morning, buried beneath the reality of who she was and who he was about to become. But as she turned off the lamp and lay down in the darkness, she could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at her across that crowded room, as though she were the only person in it who mattered. Downstairs, in the guest wing reserved for the most important visitors, Alexander sat by the window of his room, staring out at the quiet estate grounds, unable to sleep. He thought about the woman with the steady hands and tired eyes, the one who had carried herself with more quiet dignity in a single evening than most people managed in a lifetime. He thought about Camille, asleep somewhere down the hall, already planning a wedding built on convenience and family expectation rather than anything real. He thought about the life waiting for him, mapped out carefully by people who had never once asked what he actually wanted. And he thought about Elena, and the strange, unexpected feeling that had settled into his chest the moment their eyes first met across that long dining table. He did not know what he intended to do with that feeling. He only knew, as the first light of morning began creeping over the horizon, that he could not simply let it go. 3 days after the engagement dinner, a black car appeared at the edge of the Marchetti estate, and Elena, watching from an upstairs window while folding fresh linens, felt her stomach tighten before she even saw who stepped out of it. It was Alexander. He had no reason to visit so soon after the celebration. Engagements did not usually require follow-up visits from the groom, especially not ones arranged so carefully between two families who had already agreed on every detail. Yet here he was, walking up the front steps of the estate with the same composed expression he had worn the night of the dinner, as though nothing about this visit was unusual at all. Margaret greeted him warmly in the entrance hall, clearly delighted by the unexpected attention. Camille appeared moments later, dressed as though she had been preparing for this exact visit all morning, her hair perfectly arranged, her smile already in place. Elena stayed upstairs, continuing her work, telling herself firmly that whatever business brought the Duke back to the estate had nothing to do with her. She was wrong. Nearly an hour passed before Elena heard footsteps approaching the small linen room where she worked, tucked away at the end of the upstairs hallway, far from the main rooms where guests were usually received. She assumed it was Nora, the housekeeper, coming to check on her progress. Instead, when she turned around, she found Alexander standing in the doorway, looking slightly out of place among the shelves of folded sheets and towels. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elena recovered first, straightening quickly and offering a polite greeting, the kind she had been trained to give any guest who crossed her path. She asked if he needed something, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden nervousness rising in her chest. Alexander answered honestly. He said he had come to see her. Elena felt her face grow warm, though she fought hard to keep her expression neutral. She reminded him, carefully, that he was engaged to her sister, and that this conversation, whatever it was meant to be, was not appropriate. She said the words firmly, though something in her voice betrayed the fact that she did not entirely want him to leave. He did not deny the truth of what she said. Instead, he explained, quietly, that he had not been able to stop thinking about the dinner, about the way she carried herself through an evening designed to make her feel small, about the quiet strength she seemed to carry without even realizing it. He said he did not fully understand why it mattered to him so much, only that it did. Elena listened, uncertain how to respond. Part of her wanted to dismiss his words entirely, to remind him that kindness from a powerful man rarely came without complications attached. But another part of her, the part that had spent years being told she did not matter, could not help but feel something loosen inside her chest, at being truly seen for the first time in longer than she could remember. She told him, gently but firmly, that whatever he thought he felt would fade quickly once he returned to his life, to Camille, to the world he actually belonged in. She reminded him that she was nothing more than household staff now, a fact her stepmother made sure everyone understood clearly. There was no place in his world for someone like her, and she had long ago stopped believing otherwise. Alexander did not argue with her directly. He simply asked one question before he left. He asked why a woman clearly raised in this house, clearly part of this family by blood, now spent her days serving the very people who shared her last name. Elena did not have an easy answer. She told him only that circumstances had changed after her father passed away, and that some changes, once made, were not easily undone. She did not offer details, and he did not push for them, though the question stayed lodged in his mind long after he left the estate that afternoon. Word of Alexander's private visit reached Margaret before the day was over. Nora, unable to resist sharing what she had witnessed, mentioned it during an otherwise ordinary conversation, and Margaret's reaction was immediate and sharp. She summoned Elena to her study that evening, her expression cold in a way Elena recognized all too well. Margaret did not raise her voice. She never needed to. She simply reminded Elena, in a calm and measured tone, that she had been given clear instructions to remain invisible during the engagement dinner, and that whatever conversation had taken place today needed to end immediately and permanently. She reminded Elena of everything she owed this family for, allowing her to remain in the house at all, despite having no real claim to it anymore. Elena absorbed the words quietly, the way she always did, though something inside her had shifted since the night of the dinner. She did not argue, but she also did not apologize, and Margaret noticed the difference immediately, her eyes narrowing with a suspicion that had not existed before. From that point forward, Margaret made her intentions clear. Elena was reassigned to the kitchens, far from any part of the house where guests might wander. Her responsibilities expanded, until she barely had a moment to herself, between waking and collapsing into bed each night. Margaret framed the change as a simple reorganization of household duties, but Elena understood it for what it truly was: a punishment and a warning. Camille, for her part, said nothing directly to Elena about the visit, though her behavior grew colder in the days that followed. She had never been particularly warm toward her half-sister, but now there was an edge to her silence, a tension that had not existed before Alexander's unexpected visit to the linen room. Despite the increased workload and the careful distance Margaret tried to enforce, Alexander did not disappear from Elena's life the way she had expected him to. He found small, careful ways to see her, always brief, always cautious, never enough to draw the kind of attention that would create real trouble. He would appear near the edge of the property during her rare breaks, or send short messages through Peter, the young server who had first told him her name, checking simply that she was well. Elena told herself repeatedly that she should discourage this attention entirely, that nothing good could come from a duke pursuing a servant while engaged to marry someone else. But each small moment of connection chipped away at the walls she had spent years building around herself, and despite every warning she gave herself, she found herself looking forward to these brief, quiet exchanges more than she was willing to admit. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the engagement dinner, Alexander arrived at the estate under the pretense of discussing wedding arrangements with Margaret. Elena, exhausted from a long day in the kitchens, stepped outside briefly for fresh air, unaware that he had arranged his visit specifically around the hope of finding a moment alone with her. He found her sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of the garden, staring out at the darkening sky, looking more tired than he had ever seen her. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her, and sat down a respectful distance away. They talked for nearly 20 minutes that evening, longer than they had ever spoken before. Elena, worn down by exhaustion and the strange comfort of finally being asked genuine questions about her life, found herself opening up in ways she had not intended. She told him fragments of her childhood, about her father's kindness before Margaret entered their lives, about the slow, quiet way her place in the family had eroded, until nothing remained of the daughter she used to be. Alexander listened without interrupting, without offering the kind of empty sympathy she had learned to distrust from wealthy guests over the years. He simply listened and asked careful, thoughtful questions, and by the time their conversation ended, Elena realized she had told him more about herself in 20 minutes than she had shared with anyone in years. Before he left that evening, Alexander told her something that stayed with her long after he disappeared down the driveway. He said that whatever arrangement existed between himself and Camille had been built entirely on family expectation, not affection, and that he found himself increasingly unable to imagine spending his life within a marriage that felt, to him, entirely hollow. Elena warned him gently against saying such things aloud, reminding him of the consequences such words could bring if they reached the wrong ears. But she could not deny the quiet relief that settled over her at hearing him admit the truth so openly. That night, lying awake in her small room, Elena allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine a version of her life that did not involve serving trays at other people's celebrations. She did not let the thought linger long, aware of how dangerous such hope could be, but it lingered anyway, small and stubborn, refusing to fully disappear. Meanwhile, in the main house, Margaret sat alone in her study, staring at a stack of old documents she had kept locked away for years. Documents that, if ever discovered, would unravel everything she had carefully built since Edward Marchetti's death. She had heard enough about Alexander's growing attention toward Elena to understand the danger it represented, not simply to Camille's engagement, but to secrets far larger than anyone in the household yet realized. She closed the drawer carefully, locked it, and told herself firmly that whatever was happening between the Duke and her stepdaughter would end soon, one way or another. She simply needed to make certain it ended on her terms, before anyone started asking the kinds of questions she had spent 3 years making sure no one would ever think to ask. Outside, beneath a sky full of quiet stars, Elena remained unaware of the storm quietly gathering around her, focused instead on the strange, fragile warmth blooming in her chest, a feeling she had almost forgotten how to recognize: hope. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the door of Margaret's study by a courier who asked no questions and expected none in return. Margaret read it twice before setting it down with hands that were not quite steady, and by that afternoon, the entire rhythm of the Marchetti household had shifted into something colder and far more dangerous. The letter was from a lawyer named Mr. Collins, a man who had once handled Edward Marchetti's affairs before his sudden death 3 years earlier. Mr. Collins wrote to inform Margaret that a routine audit of old estate files had uncovered a discrepancy in how Edward's will had been executed, specifically regarding a trust established years earlier in Elena's name. The letter requested a meeting to clarify the matter before any further action was taken. Margaret burned the letter in the fireplace of her study that same evening, though she knew, even as the paper curled into ash, that destroying the physical page would not destroy the problem it represented. Mr. Collins would follow up, questions would eventually be asked, and if those questions were ever answered honestly, everything Margaret had built over the past 3 years would collapse. She had not planned to steal from Elena, not exactly. When Edward passed away suddenly from a failing heart, Margaret had simply seen an opportunity too convenient to ignore. Edward had established a modest trust for Elena years earlier, separate from the rest of his estate, meant to ensure his daughter would always have something to call her own, regardless of what happened within the family. Margaret, acting quickly during the chaotic weeks following his death, had quietly redirected the trust into accounts controlled entirely by herself, using forged signatures and a cooperative bank manager who asked no uncomfortable questions in exchange for generous compensation. Elena, grieving and unaware of the details surrounding her father's finances, had accepted Margaret's explanation that no inheritance had been left specifically for her, that Edward's estate had gone entirely toward maintaining the household and covering outstanding debts. She had no reason to question the story. She was too consumed by grief, and later, by the slow, steady erosion of her place within the family, to ever suspect that a stack of forged documents had quietly stolen her future while she mourned her father. Now, 3 years later, that carefully buried theft threatened to surface at the worst possible moment. Margaret understood immediately that Alexander's growing attention toward Elena represented more than a simple threat to Camille's engagement. If Elena ever discovered the truth about her inheritance, and if she had someone as powerful and well-connected as a duke standing beside her when she did, the consequences would extend far beyond embarrassment. Fraud on this scale carried serious legal consequences, consequences that could destroy not only Margaret's reputation, but her freedom as well. She needed Elena gone from the estate, and she needed it done quickly, before Mr. Collins scheduled his meeting, and before Alexander's interest in Elena grew into something Margaret could no longer control. The following morning, Margaret summoned Elena to her study once again, though this time her tone carried none of the icy calm from their previous conversation. Instead, she informed Elena that her services within the household would no longer be required, effective immediately. She explained, coldly, that Elena's presence had become disruptive, that her behavior around the Duke had embarrassed the family, and that it was time for her to make her own way in the world. away from the estate that had, according to Margaret, been generous enough to shelter her this long already. Elena absorbed the news with a strange, quiet calm, though inside, panic began building rapidly. She had no savings of her own, no independent income, nowhere to go beyond the walls of the only home she had ever known. She asked Margaret carefully where exactly she was expected to go, and Margaret simply shrugged, telling her that was no longer the family's concern. Elena left the study that morning with instructions to pack her belongings by the end of the week. She wandered through the halls of the estate in a daze, trying to process how quickly everything had unraveled, how completely her stepmother had decided to erase her from the only life she had left. She did not immediately tell Alexander what had happened. Some stubborn part of her refused to make herself his problem to solve, refused to let him see her as someone in need of rescue, rather than someone capable of standing on her own. But Peter, the young server who had become something close to a friend over the past few weeks, noticed the change in her almost immediately and pressed her gently until she finally admitted the truth. Peter, without telling Elena, sent word to Alexander that same evening. Alexander arrived at the estate the following morning, earlier than any previous visit, his composed demeanor replaced by something sharper, more determined. He requested a private meeting with Margaret, and though she agreed reluctantly, she made it clear from the moment he entered her study that she had no intention of discussing household staffing decisions with a guest who had no authority over them. Alexander did not raise his voice, though the intensity behind his words left no room for misunderstanding. He informed Margaret that he was aware Elena had been dismissed from the household without notice or support, and he made it clear that he found the timing of this decision, occurring so soon after his own growing interest in Elena became apparent, deeply suspicious. Margaret, composed despite the tightening panic in her chest, insisted the decision had nothing to do with him, that household matters were entirely her own concern, and that his interference in family business was both inappropriate and unwelcome, given his engagement to her daughter. Alexander's response was quiet, but unshakable. He told Margaret plainly that he intended to look further into the circumstances surrounding Elena's place within the family, including the details of her father's estate, and he suggested, without stating it outright, that he already had questions about how a woman clearly raised as Edward Marchetti's daughter had come to occupy the position of household servant within her own family home. Margaret's expression flickered, just briefly, before she recovered her composure, but Alexander had seen enough in that brief moment of hesitation to confirm what he had already begun to suspect. There was something buried beneath the surface of this family's carefully maintained appearance, something Margaret was desperate to keep hidden. He left the estate that morning without further confrontation, but his mind was already working through the next steps. He contacted his own family's legal advisor, a sharp and thorough man named Mr. Bennett, and asked him to quietly investigate the details surrounding Edward Marchetti's estate and the terms of his original will. He also reached out, discreetly, to Mr. Collins, the lawyer whose letter had sparked Margaret's panic in the first place, requesting a meeting of his own. Meanwhile, Elena continued packing her few belongings into a single worn suitcase, uncertain where she would go once the week ended. She had no family beyond this household willing to take her in, no close friends outside the small circle of household staff who had shown her kindness over the years. The prospect of leaving felt less like freedom and more like being cast out into an uncertain and frightening unknown. Camille, watching the preparations from a distance, finally approached her half-sister directly for the first time in weeks. Her tone carried none of the coldness Elena had come to expect, replaced instead by something closer to genuine confusion and, perhaps, guilt she had not yet learned to fully acknowledge. Camille asked Elena directly whether the rumors were true, whether Alexander had truly shown interest in her during the engagement dinner and in the weeks since. Elena, exhausted and with little left to lose, answered honestly for the first time in longer than she could remember. She admitted that something had shifted between herself and Alexander, though she insisted she had never intended to interfere with Camille's engagement, that she had tried repeatedly to discourage his attention out of respect for the arrangement between their families. Camille listened quietly, her expression unreadable, before finally admitting something Elena had never expected to hear. She confessed that her own engagement to Alexander had always felt hollow, arranged more for status and family advantage than any real connection between them. She admitted that she had noticed the coldness in his eyes long before the engagement dinner, that she had simply chosen to ignore it because the marriage promised everything her mother had always wanted for her. For the first time in years, the two sisters spoke honestly with one another, without the weight of Margaret's careful manipulation hovering over every word. Camille admitted that she had always resented Elena, not because of anything Elena had done, but because Margaret had spent years teaching her that Elena's presence in the family represented a threat to everything Camille was entitled to inherit. Elena, moved despite herself, admitted that she had spent years believing she deserved the treatment she received, that she had convinced herself she held no real claim to the life or family she had been born into. The conversation left both women shaken, though something between them had shifted permanently, a fragile beginning of understanding neither had expected to find. That same evening, Mr. Bennet contacted Alexander with troubling news. His preliminary investigation into Edward Marchetti's estate had uncovered irregularities in the handling of a trust established years earlier, irregularities that pointed directly toward fraudulent activity following Edward's death. He recommended immediate further investigation, warning Alexander that whoever had orchestrated the fraud had done so carefully, using forged documentation that would require careful legal work to fully expose. Alexander realized immediately what this meant. Elena's dismissal from the household had not been a simple act of jealousy or spite. It had been a calculated attempt to remove her before the truth of Margaret's deception could surface, to push her far enough away that she would have no resources, no support, and no ability to challenge whatever legal battle might eventually unfold. He understood, with growing urgency, that Elena needed to know the truth immediately, before Margaret found some way to push her out of reach entirely. He arrived at the estate late that night, well past the hour guests typically visited, and requested to see Elena directly, refusing to wait until morning despite the housekeeper's protests. Nora, sensing the seriousness in his expression, finally relented and led him to the small room where Elena sat, surrounded by half-packed boxes, staring blankly at the walls that had, for better or worse, always represented home. Alexander explained everything he had discovered, carefully and clearly, watching Elena's expression shift from confusion to disbelief, to a slow, dawning anger that had been buried beneath years of quiet acceptance. She had spent 3 years believing her father left her nothing, believing she held no rightful claim to anything beyond the charity of a stepmother who resented her presence. Now, suddenly, she understood that everything she believed about her own worthlessness within this family had been built on a carefully constructed lie. She asked Alexander, her voice shaking slightly, what exactly this meant for her now. He told her honestly that the path ahead would not be simple, that exposing fraud on this scale would require legal action, patience, and considerable courage. But he also told her, with a certainty that steadied something inside her, that she would not have to face any of it alone. Elena, overwhelmed by the sudden collision of grief, anger, and unexpected hope, allowed herself, for the first time in years, to imagine a future where she was not simply surviving within someone else's household, but standing fully and rightfully within a life that had always been hers to claim. Downstairs, unaware that her carefully guarded secret had already begun unraveling, Margaret slept soundly, confident that removing Elena from the estate had solved the problem entirely. She had no idea that the woman she believed she had successfully erased was, at that very moment, discovering the truth that would soon bring her entire carefully constructed world crashing down around her. Mr. Collins arrived at the estate 3 days later, carrying a leather folder filled with documents that would soon change the course of everyone involved. He had requested the meeting formally, listing it as a routine review of Edward Marchetti's estate records, though everyone present understood the true purpose behind his visit carried far greater weight than any ordinary paperwork review. Margaret received him in the main sitting room, composed and polite on the surface, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed the anxiety she had been carrying since his letter first arrived. She had spent the past 3 days trying to prepare herself for this conversation, rehearsing careful explanations for the irregularities Mr. Collins had discovered, though no rehearsed answer felt sufficient against the weight of what she actually knew to be true. She had not expected Alexander to be present for the meeting. He arrived alongside Mr. Bennet, his own family's legal advisor, and the moment Margaret saw them enter the room together, she understood immediately that whatever careful explanations she had prepared would not be enough to control the direction this conversation was about to take. Elena arrived last, accompanied quietly by Camille, who had insisted on being present, despite Margaret's obvious discomfort at the idea. The two sisters had spoken several times in the days since their first honest conversation, and though their relationship remained fragile and uncertain, Camille had made her position clear. She would no longer stand silently beside a mother willing to steal from one daughter to benefit another. The meeting began formally, with Mr. Collins laying out the documentation his office had uncovered during the routine estate audit. He explained, carefully and methodically, that Edward Marchetti's original will had included a clearly documented trust, established specifically for Elena, separate from the rest of the estate, meant to provide for her independently, regardless of any future changes within the household. He explained further that within weeks of Edward's death, this trust had been quietly redirected through a series of transactions bearing Margaret's authorization, transactions that included signatures purporting to belong to Edward himself, despite being dated weeks after his passing. Margaret's composure cracked slightly at this point, though she attempted, weakly, to explain the discrepancy as a simple administrative error, a misunderstanding that could easily be resolved without further complication. Mr. Collins, unmoved by her explanation, produced additional documentation showing a pattern of similar transactions over the following months, each one moving portions of Elena's inheritance into accounts controlled entirely by Margaret. The room fell silent as the full scope of the deception became clear. Elena sat quietly, absorbing information that confirmed everything Alexander had warned her about days earlier, though hearing it laid out so plainly, with such damning clarity, still struck her with a force she had not fully prepared herself for. Margaret, sensing the meeting slipping entirely beyond her control, shifted tactics abruptly. She turned toward Elena directly, her voice taking on a pleading edge that Elena had never heard from her before. She explained that the funds had been used, in part, to maintain the estate itself, to cover expenses that would have otherwise left the entire household, Elena included, without a home at all. She framed her actions as difficult but necessary decisions made during an impossibly difficult period, following Edward's sudden death. Elena listened to this explanation without visible reaction, though something inside her had grown steady and resolute over the past several days, a quiet strength that no longer bent easily beneath Margaret's carefully constructed narratives. She reminded Margaret calmly that whatever difficulties the household faced following her father's death did not require forged signatures, did not require years of deliberate deception, and certainly did not require reducing his own daughter to the position of unpaid servant within her own childhood home. Margaret had no adequate response to this, and the silence that followed confirmed, more clearly than any document could, the truth everyone in the room already understood. Mr. Collins explained the legal path forward carefully. The fraud, given its scale and the clear evidence of forged documentation, constituted a serious criminal matter, one that would likely result in significant legal consequences for Margaret, regardless of any restitution she might offer now. He explained that Elena, as the rightful recipient of the original trust, held every legal right to pursue full recovery of the funds, along with any additional damages resulting from years of mistreatment stemming directly from Margaret's deception. Margaret, growing increasingly desperate, turned toward Camille, seeking some form of support or defense from the daughter she had spent years favoring above all else. But Camille, her expression carrying more sorrow than anger, simply shook her head. She told her mother quietly that she could no longer defend actions that had caused so much harm to someone who deserved so much better, regardless of what that admission might mean for their own relationship going forward. The meeting continued for nearly 2 more hours, working through the legal details of how the fraud would be formally addressed, what restitution might look like, and what consequences Margaret would ultimately face for her actions. Throughout the discussion, Alexander remained close beside Elena, though he said little, understanding that this moment belonged to her, far more than it belonged to him. When the meeting finally concluded, Margaret retreated to her study alone, the full weight of exposure settling over her in ways she had spent 3 years successfully avoiding. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that the careful world she had built for herself and Camille had never truly been secure, that it had always rested on a foundation destined eventually to collapse beneath the weight of its own deception. Elena, meanwhile, stepped outside into the garden, needing space to process everything that had just unfolded. Alexander followed a few moments later, giving her the silence she needed before finally speaking. He asked her, gently, how she felt now that the truth had finally come to light. Elena considered the question carefully before answering honestly. She told him she felt relief, certainly, and a kind of validation she had not realized she desperately needed after years of believing the mistreatment she endured was somehow deserved. But she also felt something closer to grief, mourning the years she had lost, believing herself unworthy of a life that had, in truth, always belonged to her. Alexander listened without offering easy reassurances, understanding that some wounds required time rather than quick comfort. He simply stayed beside her, present and steady, allowing her the space to process everything without pressure or expectation. In the days that followed, news of the fraud investigation spread quietly through the small social circles surrounding the Marchetti and Whitmore families. Margaret's carefully cultivated reputation began unraveling rapidly, as details of the deception became impossible to fully contain. Invitations that once arrived regularly stopped coming. Friends who had once praised Margaret's social standing suddenly found reasons to distance themselves from the growing scandal. Camille, navigating her own complicated grief over her mother's actions, made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She approached Alexander privately, formally requesting that their engagement be dissolved, explaining honestly that she no longer believed either of them had ever truly wanted this marriage for the right reasons. Alexander, relieved by her honesty, agreed immediately, and the two parted on terms far more amicable than anyone following the earlier drama might have expected. With the engagement formally ended, and with the legal process surrounding Margaret's fraud moving steadily forward, Elena found herself, for the first time in years, standing at the edge of a future that finally felt entirely her own to shape. She did not yet know exactly what that future would look like. The trust, once recovered, would provide her with financial independence she had never expected to have. The relationship slowly rebuilding between herself and Camille offered the possibility of family connection she had believed lost forever. And Alexander, patient and steady throughout every difficult step of the past several weeks, remained quietly, consistently present, never once pushing her toward decisions she was not yet ready to make. Late one evening, sitting together on the same low garden wall where their first real conversation had taken place weeks earlier, Elena finally allowed herself to ask the question that had been building steadily inside her since that very first night at the engagement dinner. She asked Alexander, plainly, what exactly he wanted, now that circumstances had shifted so dramatically for both of them. He answered without hesitation. He told her he wanted the chance to know her, fully and honestly, without the complications of engagements or family obligations standing between them. He told her he had no interest in rushing toward anything, that he simply wanted the opportunity to build something real, at whatever pace felt right to her. Elena, moved by the simplicity and honesty of his answer, felt something inside her finally begin to settle after weeks of uncertainty and upheaval. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the future ahead of her did not feel like something to survive. It felt like something to hope for. 6 months passed before the legal proceedings surrounding Margaret's fraud finally reached their conclusion, and by the time the final judgment arrived, the Marchetti estate had changed in ways no one could have predicted on the night of that fateful engagement dinner. Margaret faced serious legal consequences for her actions, including a lengthy period of probation, mandatory restitution of the stolen funds, along with significant additional damages, and a formal criminal record that permanently closed the door on the social standing she had spent years carefully constructing. She avoided imprisonment only through a combination of cooperation with investigators and the absence of any prior criminal history, though the court made clear that the severity of her deception had come dangerously close to warranting far harsher consequences. Elena chose not to attend the final hearing, where sentencing was formally announced. She had spent enough months immersed in legal proceedings, reliving painful details of her father's death and the years of mistreatment that followed, and she felt no need to witness the final chapter of Margaret's downfall in person. Instead, she received the news quietly, through a brief phone call from Mr. Collins, and allowed herself a single evening to sit with the strange mixture of relief and sorrow that came with finally seeing justice served, even against someone who had caused her so much pain. The recovered trust, along with the additional damages awarded through the settlement, gave Elena a level of financial independence she had never imagined possible during her years of quiet servitude within the household. For the first time since her father's death, she held the resources to build a life entirely on her own terms, free from dependence on anyone else's goodwill or generosity. She chose, at first, to move slowly. Rather than immediately relocating to a new home or pursuing any dramatic change, Elena spent several months simply adjusting to the reality of her new circumstances, working through the layers of grief and displaced identity that years of mistreatment had left behind. She began seeing a counselor recommended by Mr. Bennett's office, someone experienced in helping people rebuild their sense of self after prolonged periods of manipulation and diminishment. The sessions were difficult, often uncomfortable, but slowly, steadily, Elena began reconnecting with parts of herself she had buried years earlier, simply to survive within a household that valued her silence far more than her voice. Camille, meanwhile, navigated her own difficult transition. With her mother's reputation destroyed and the engagement to Alexander formally dissolved, she found herself, for the first time in her life, without the safety net of wealth and status she had always assumed would carry her forward. Rather than resenting this sudden shift, Camille approached it with a determination that surprised everyone who had known her before the scandal broke. She enrolled in university courses she had previously dismissed as unnecessary, pursuing an education she had never seriously considered, while assuming marriage and family connections would secure her future indefinitely. She and Elena continued rebuilding their relationship slowly, meeting regularly for quiet conversations that gradually replaced years of resentment and misunderstanding with something closer to genuine sisterhood. Neither pretended the damage of their shared history could be erased entirely, but both found, in these careful conversations, a foundation for something real beginning to take shape between them. Alexander remained a steady presence throughout Elena's months of healing, though he was careful never to rush her, never to treat her recovery as an obstacle standing between himself and the relationship he hoped they might eventually build together. He visited regularly, always respectful of whatever boundaries Elena needed to maintain, always patient with the slow, uneven pace of her healing. Their relationship deepened gradually, built not on the dramatic intensity of their first meeting at the engagement dinner, but on the quieter, steadier foundation of genuine friendship, honest conversation, and mutual respect. Elena found herself, over time, trusting him in ways she had never fully trusted anyone since her father's death, and Alexander, for his part, found in Elena exactly the kind of honest, grounded partnership he had never believed possible within the carefully performed world of arranged engagements and social expectation. Nearly a year after the night Elena first served wine at her sister's engagement dinner, she stood once again in a formal dining room, though everything about the moment felt entirely different from that painful evening so many months earlier. This time, she was not dressed in a plain black uniform, carrying trays between tables while trying desperately not to be noticed. This time, she stood at the center of the room, surrounded by people who had come specifically to celebrate her, wearing a simple, elegant dress she had chosen entirely for herself, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she truly belonged exactly where she stood. Alexander stood beside her, and though neither of them rushed toward grand declarations or dramatic promises, the quiet certainty between them spoke more clearly than any rehearsed speech could have managed. He had asked her, simply and honestly, several weeks earlier, whether she might consider building a future together, not as a rescue or a rushed decision, born from the chaos of the past year, but as a genuine partnership between two people who had come to know and respect each other fully. Elena had said yes, not because circumstances demanded it, and not because she needed rescuing from a life she no longer had the strength to build alone, but because she had finally reached a place where she could choose partnership from genuine strength rather than desperate necessity. Camille attended the small celebration that evening, standing proudly beside the sister she had once viewed as a rival, now understanding clearly the value of the relationship they had worked so hard to rebuild. She raised a quiet toast to Elena, acknowledging openly, in front of the small gathering of friends and family, how much she admired the resilience Elena had shown throughout every difficult step of the past year. Margaret was not present. She had relocated to a smaller residence following the conclusion of her legal proceedings, living now a quiet, considerably diminished life, far removed from the social circles she had once dominated so carefully. Elena felt no satisfaction in her stepmother's downfall, though she also felt no obligation to extend forgiveness before she was genuinely ready to offer it. Some relationships, she had come to understand, simply could not be repaired, and accepting that truth, rather than forcing false reconciliation, had become an important part of her healing. As the evening continued, Elena found herself standing near the same large windows where, nearly a year earlier, she had watched Camille's engagement announced to a room full of guests who had never once considered her presence worth acknowledging. Now, standing in that same space, surrounded by people who saw her fully and valued her completely, she allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. She thought about the frightened, exhausted woman who had carried trays through that same room months earlier, convinced she deserved nothing more than quiet servitude within a family that had long since stopped seeing her as anything more than an inconvenience. She thought about the folded napkin left carelessly on her tray that same evening, carrying words that had, against every expectation, changed the entire course of her life. Alexander found her there, watching the quiet reflection cross her expression, and asked gently what she was thinking about. Elena smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that had become increasingly natural over the past several months, and told him simply that she was thinking about how far she had come since the night he first noticed her across a crowded room. He reminded her, quietly, that he had noticed far more than just her presence that evening. He had noticed her strength, her quiet dignity, and a resilience that had drawn him toward her before he even understood why. Everything that followed, he told her, had simply confirmed what he sensed clearly from that very first glance. Elena, standing beside the man who had refused to look away from her even when the entire world seemed determined to render her invisible, finally allowed herself to fully believe something she had spent years denying herself the right to feel. She belonged. Not as a servant, not as an afterthought, and not as someone grateful simply for scraps of attention from a family that had never truly valued her. She belonged fully, completely, and entirely on her own terms, in a life she had fought hard to reclaim, standing beside someone who had seen her worth from the very beginning, long before she had learned to see it fully in herself. As the celebration continued around them, filled with warmth and laughter, and the quiet comfort of genuine connection, Elena felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely and entirely at peace. The girl who had once been made invisible now stood fully seen, fully valued, and finally, completely free.